Warning: this story is deeply disturbing. 45 minutes before midnight on January 16th, 1936, the chaplain of New York's Sing Sing maximum security prison walked down a long, quiet corridor toward a stark, isolated cell. Inside, a condemned prisoner bound for the electric chair was being shaved. A guard gently raked a razor blade over the final few patches of stubble on his scalp, then unceremoniously repeated the process on the prisoner's legs. When the time came, the prisoner was led from his cell to the execution chamber, the grim silence broken only by the whispered prayers of the prison chaplain. Inside the chamber, the dark silhouette of the iconic electric chair was suddenly illuminated as a guard flicked on the lights. The condemned was guided to the chair, its leather straps tightened around his arms, legs, and chest. A moistened sponge was placed under a metal skull cap on his shaved head, and another electrode was secured to the bare patch of flesh on his freshly shaven leg. Once he was secured, a guard pulled back a pair of dark curtains, revealing an observation room filled with journalists, officials, and relatives of the condemned victims. Their faces were a mix of steely resolve and silent dread. When asked if he had any last words, the condemned simply muttered, "I don't even know why I'm here." The guards, who had spent almost a year ensuring his continual imprisonment, were underwhelmed by the final, limp statement. One of them turned to the condemned's attorney, James Dempsey, who held several pages of handwritten notes penned by his client in the final hours before execution. When asked to reveal the contents, Dempsey replied, "I will never show those letters to anyone. The most filthy, stomach-churning string of obscenities I have ever read." This was no ordinary prisoner. He was one of the most frighteningly deranged serial predators in American history. The media had dubbed him the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. But his real name was Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C., on May 19, 1870. He was the youngest child of his parents, conceived when his father was 74 years old, and born into a family plagued by serious mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania, one of his brothers was confined to a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with mental affliction at a young age. 3 other relatives were also diagnosed with mental illnesses, while his own mother was said to suffer from auditory and visual hallucinations. On October 16, 1875, Albert's father suffered a fatal heart attack while at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. His death left the family in turmoil. Believing herself unfit to care for him, Albert's mother sent him to St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. There, corporal punishment was rampant. It was at this orphanage that young Albert first began to develop an intense paraphilia associated with pain and suffering. Whenever a child misbehaved, they were beaten mercilessly. While some adapted to the brutal environment, others lost their minds completely. Albert, however, learned to enjoy the pain inflicted upon him. After 5 long years, Albert's mother was able to secure a government job, which allowed her to remove him from the orphanage. But when she retrieved her 10-year-old son, he was not the same child she had left. Growing up, his mother had called him Ham, and his friends affectionately referred to him as Ham and Eggs. But upon his release from the orphanage, he insisted on being called Albert, a name that had belonged to his deceased brother. His mother found this deeply unsettling, an early sign of his growing mental instability. At the age of 12, Albert befriended a local telegraph boy who introduced him to grotesque practices, including consuming his own bodily waste. This disturbing behavior was just the beginning of a descent into unimaginable depravity. As a teenager, Albert frequented public bathhouses, not to bathe, but to loiter in the changing areas and watch boys undress. His obsession only deepened over time. Eventually, he took up writing threatening and obscene letters to women whose names he found in newspaper ads. In early 1890, Albert moved to New York City. At 20 years old, he quickly exhausted his meager savings and resorted to prostitution. He also began molesting children, primarily targeting boys under the age of 6. His concerned mother, still doting on him, arranged a marriage for him in 1898 to 19-year-old Anna Hoffman. They had 6 children together over the next 5 years, but financial struggles drove Albert into crime. In 1903, Albert was arrested, convicted of grand larceny, and incarcerated at Sing Sing prison. Upon his release, He was a changed man. His interest in family life dwindled, and his focus shifted to acts of extreme depravity. In one disturbing instance, he and a male lover attended a wax exhibition where he became obsessed with mutilation after seeing a bisection of a human penis. This moment ignited a sinister fixation that would shape his future crimes. Around 1910, while working in Wilmington, Delaware, Fish met 19-year-old Thomas Bedden, a young man with a mental disability. Fish lured him to a secluded farmhouse under the pretense of a romantic encounter, but instead, he subjected him to 2 weeks of relentless torture. Bedden was beaten, burned, flayed, and starved before Fish castrated him with a straight razor. Though Fish initially intended to kill him, he ultimately chose to let him live. He cleaned the wound with peroxide, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left Bedden $10, and disappeared. By 1917, Fish's wife left him, and his mental state rapidly deteriorated. He began experiencing hallucinations, walking the streets wrapped in carpets, and proclaiming himself a disciple of John the Baptist. He also started self-mutilating, driving needles into his pelvis and hitting himself with a nail-studded paddle. His madness reached a breaking point in 1919 when he randomly stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in the chest multiple times before walking away. His crimes escalated in the 1920s. On July 11, 1921, he approached 8-year-old Beatrice Keel while she was playing alone at her family's farm in Staten Island. He offered her money to help him pick rhubarb, and she agreed. Just as she was about to leave with him, her mother intervened and chased him away. This would not be his last attempt at luring a child, nor would it be the worst of his crimes.